Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The last words Walt Disney ever wrote. There is something quietly devastating about the idea of a last note. Not a letter, not a grand farewell speech composed in candlelight with trembling hands and a quill dipped in ceremony. Just a note, scrawled on a scrap of paper, written by a man who almost certainly did not know, in that particular moment, that his hands would never hold the pen again. You think about that sometimes. The way ordinary moments disguise themselves as ordinary. The way the universe neglects to send any signal at all that something is ending. No drum roll, no dimming of lights. Just a man sitting at a desk on a Tuesday afternoon in December of 1966, writing words on paper the way he had written words on paper 10,000 times before, and then setting the pen down, and then walking out, and then never coming back. The name he wrote was Kurt Russell. You will sit with that for a moment, because it deserves a moment. Of all the things Walt Disney might have written as his final earthly notation, of all the grand visions and philosophical musings and architectural dreams that must have been swirling continuously through that particular mind, what ended up on the paper was the name of a young actor. A teenager, really. A kid from Springfield, Illinois, who had been doing bit parts around the studio lot, and who Walt had apparently been considering for something larger, something with more weight and substance, a role that would require a specific kind of charm. And so, Walt had written the name down. Kurt Russell. 2 words, and then, by some strange arithmetic of fate and biology, those 2 words became the final message Walt Disney ever committed to paper. You find yourself wondering what the desk looked like that afternoon. You picture it the way you picture most things from that era, slightly soft around the edges, warm with the amber tones of late afternoon California sunshine coming through windows that overlooked the lot he had built from almost nothing. The studio in Burbank was his in a way that buildings almost never are truly anyone's. He had walked those streets when they were still being poured. He had stood on scaffolding. He had argued about ceiling heights and color palettes, and whether the water fountains were in the right place. The desk itself was a working desk, not a museum piece, covered in the organized chaos of a man who thought faster than his filing system could accommodate. Sketches, memos, blueprints for things that did not exist yet and might never exist, and existed only in the very specific architecture of his imagination. He was 65 years old that December. 65 is not ancient, not in the way we sometimes speak of ancient. It is the age of a person who still has plans, and Walt had plans the way other men had furniture, in large quantities, arranged to fill every available space, impossible to ignore, constantly in need of rearranging. There was the Florida Project, which everyone around him was calling the Florida Project, in hushed, reverent tones, because it was so enormous in its ambition that speaking about it too loudly felt somehow dangerous, as though volume alone might cause it to collapse under the weight of its own grandeur. There were the films in various stages of production. There were the television commitments, the park expansions, the conversations about what Tomorrowland should look like in 10 years, in 20 years. in the impossible shimmering future that Walt seemed to inhabit, even when everyone else was firmly rooted in the present. He smoked. That is perhaps the simplest and most brutal fact woven through the story of his final months. He had smoked for decades, the way men of his generation smoked, constantly, reflexively, as though the cigarette was simply an extension of the thinking process rather than a separate activity. Visitors to his office remember the air being thick with it. Colleagues remember sharing ashtrays with him during meetings that stretched through entire afternoons. It is one of those historical details that arrives with a particular weight of sadness, not because smoking was unusual, or because anyone should have known better by the standards of the time, but because you can trace such a clean and terrible line between the habit and what came next. The diagnosis arrived in the autumn of 1966. Lung cancer, left lung, the kind of news that lands differently depending on the person receiving it, and Walt, by most accounts, received it with a characteristic refusal to let it immediately reorganize his sense of what was possible. He had surgery in November. He went home to recover. And then, with a stubbornness that was either admirable or heartbreaking, depending on your perspective, and possibly both simultaneously, he went back to work. You try to imagine what that felt like, to know the thing you know, and then to drive to the studio anyway, to sit at the desk anyway, to pick up the phone and call about the Florida property anyway. There is something in it that speaks to the particular relationship Walt had with the idea of forward momentum, as though stopping, truly stopping, would constitute some kind of defeat that the diagnosis itself had not yet managed to achieve. He was a man who had survived bankruptcy. He had survived the collapse of his first studio. He had survived the animation strike of 1941, which had wounded him in ways that went well beyond the financial, cutting into something more personal and more lasting. He had rebuilt things more times than most people build them once. Stopping was not, for Walt Disney, a natural resting state. And so he went back to the desk. He sat in the chair, he pulled papers toward him, and he made notes, and he wrote names on scraps of paper, and one of those names on one of those scraps was Kurt Russell. There is a version of this story that wants to make the Kurt Russell detail into something larger and more symbolic than it might actually be. You can feel the temptation, the pull of narrative gravity toward meaning, toward the idea that even in his final conscious hours, Walt was thinking about the future, about the next generation of talent, about who would carry things forward. And maybe that is true. Maybe sitting there with the knowledge of what the doctors had told him, with whatever physical discomfort he was managing through sheer force of will, Walt looked at a list of young actors and thought about which ones had the specific quality he was looking for, and the answer was the kid from Springfield, and he wrote the name down. Or maybe it was simply Tuesday. Maybe it was a Tuesday afternoon task on a long list of Tuesday afternoon tasks, and it carried no more existential weight than any of the other notations he made that day. Maybe the universe is not always in the business of manufacturing profundity, and sometimes a name on a piece of paper is only a name on a piece of paper. But you are here, in this particular story, in this particular evening, and so perhaps you will allow yourself the gentler interpretation. Perhaps Walt was thinking about the future because Walt was always thinking about the future. It was, by every account ever written about him, his most defining characteristic. Not nostalgia, though he understood nostalgia and used it masterfully in his work. Not sentiment, though his films were saturated with it. What drove him was the thing ahead, the next project, the next park, the next film, the next decade. He looked forward with such intensity and consistency that the people around him sometimes had to sprint just to keep him in sight. You settle into that image for a moment. Walt at the desk, December of 1966, the California winter outside, which is to say a winter that most of the world would classify as a pleasantly mild autumn. The light going golden and horizontal in the late afternoon, the way it does in Southern California, streaming through the windows of the building he had designed, falling across the peepers on the desk he had chosen, landing on the hand that held the pen that wrote the name. Kurt Russell. He would have been 16 years old that year. He had appeared in a small Disney television movie called Mosby's Marauders, and had, apparently, made enough of an impression that his name ended up on Walt's mental list of people worth watching. Whether Walt had seen him work in person, or had watched footage, or had simply heard about him from someone else on the lot, is not entirely clear from the historical record, which has the characteristic gaps and ambiguities of all historical records, particularly those concerning the private thoughts of private moments. What is clear is that the name made it onto the paper. Years later, Kurt Russell would talk about this with a kind of bemused wonder that is entirely understandable. To learn that the last thing Walt Disney ever wrote was your name carries a weight that is difficult to process regardless of how much time has passed. It is not exactly a burden. It is more like a strange inheritance, something you did not ask for and cannot return and do not quite know where to put. Russell would go on to have a long career, much of it in films that had nothing to do with Disney, but the origin point of that career is permanently marked by this peculiar fact, this accident of timing, this strange proximity to the end of something enormous. And Walt Disney was enormous. You should probably say that plainly and without apology, because the scale of what he built and what he imagined is the context without which the story of his final days makes no particular sense. He was not a man who had a job. He was a man who had, over the course of 4 decades of relentless and frequently exhausting creative labor, constructed an entire universe. Not a metaphorical universe, a literal one, with its own geography and its own citizens and its own internal logic that governed how things looked and sounded and felt. He had invented a mouse, which sounds modest, and then he had used that mouse as the seed crystal around which an entire civilization of characters and stories and animated worlds had slowly accumulated. He had built Disneyland in Anaheim, California, which opened in July of 1955, after a construction period so compressed and chaotic that it is remarkable the park opened at all. The opening day was famously disastrous in certain respects, with rides breaking down and counterfeit tickets flooding the gates and the asphalt on Main Street still soft enough in the July heat to swallow the heels of women's shoes. But Walt had been there for all of it, and the park had survived its opening day, and within its first year it had become something that no one, including its creator, had fully anticipated. It had become a place that people needed, not just wanted, needed. Needed in the specific way that humans need spaces that remind them of something they cannot quite name, some quality of wonder or safety, or the feeling of being a child in a world that makes sense. That was Walt's particular genius, if you want to call it genius, which many people do, and which he himself would likely have deflected with his characteristic self-deprecation about simply doing what needed to be done. He understood, on a level that seemed almost biological, what people were hungry for, not what they said they were hungry for, not what they reported in surveys or expressed in letters, what they were hungry for at the level beneath language, the level where feeling lives before it gets translated into words. He could reach down into that level and pull things up and make them visible and put them on a screen or in a park or on a record, and people would see them and feel the specific satisfaction of a longing they had not previously been able to articulate, suddenly finding its shape. He had done this with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, which was the first feature-length animated film, and which was greeted with such skepticism during its production that the industry took to calling it Disney's folly. The folly grossed more than $8 million in its initial release, at a time when $8 million was a figure that could comfortably reorder the economic landscape of an entire studio. He had done it with Fantasia and Dumbo and Bambi and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and a long catalogue of films that, taken together, constitute something very close to a childhood mythology for multiple generations of people across multiple continents. He had done it with the television program that bore his name, which brought the studio into living rooms across America starting in the 1950s, and which, not incidentally, also helped finance Disneyland by giving ABC a compelling reason to become an early investor. Walt understood, before most people understood, that television was not a lesser medium, but simply a different one, and that a presence in it was not a compromise, but a strategy. All of this was in progress, in various stages of completion and planning, when he sat down at that desk in December of 1966. The Florida Project alone would have constituted a sufficient life's work for most people. He was envisioning something he called Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, which was not at that point the theme park it would eventually become, but rather a genuinely radical proposal for a functioning city, a city that would be planned from the ground up around the best available thinking about transportation and housing and energy and community, a city where people would actually live and work, served by technology and design, working in genuine harmony, a demonstration to the rest of the world that urban life did not have to be the compromised and exhausting thing it had generally become. It was an extraordinary vision. It was also, possibly, completely impossible. But impossibility had never been a reliable deterrent for Walt Disney, and so the plans were being drawn. The land in Florida was being quietly and carefully acquired through a network of dummy corporations designed to prevent the price of real estate from going vertical the moment Disney's involvement became known, and Walt was in the middle of all of it, thinking forward with his characteristic intensity, writing names on pieces of paper. He went into the hospital in early December. The surgery had not resolved things the way everyone had hoped. His body was doing what bodies do when they are very sick and very tired and have been running at the kind of sustained intensity that Waltz had run at for 4 decades. He was in St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, not far from the studio, and he continued to receive visitors and to make phone calls and to talk about the Florida Project with the people who were working on it. His wife, Lillian, was there. His brother, Roy, was there. Roy, who had been Walt's financial partner and business anchor, an occasional voice of restraint since the very beginning, who had in many ways made possible everything Walt had imagined by managing the economic architecture that supported the creative one. On December 15th, 1966, at 10 minutes past 10 in the morning, Walt Disney died. He was 65 years old, and he had been many things, and he had built many things, and one of the last things he had done was write a name on a piece of paper. You think about Roy Disney in those first hours. Roy was 73 years old, and he had spent the better part of half a century in partnership with his younger brother, a partnership that had been, by every account, both genuinely close and genuinely complicated, because genius of Walt's particular variety does not arrive without friction, and living adjacent to it for decades leaves marks. Roy had planned to retire. He had been clear about this. After Walt's death, the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the thing that a 73-year-old man with a lifetime of work already behind him was entirely entitled to do, was to step back and let younger hands take the wheel. Instead, Roy announced that he would oversee the completion of the Florida project. He dedicated himself to it with a devotion that people who knew him described as both touching and slightly alarming in its intensity. He insisted that the park be called Walt Disney World rather than simply Disney World, because he wanted the name in the title, wanted every ticket and every sign and every piece of merchandise to carry the name of the man who had imagined the thing before it existed. Walt Disney World opened in October of 1971. Roy attended the opening. 2 months later, he died. There is a whole separate story in that, a story about brothers and legacy and the weight of finishing someone else's dream. But that story is adjacent to this one rather than inside it, and this one is about a piece of paper and a name and an afternoon in December. Kurt Russell, when he learned about the note, was already on the other side of his Disney years. He had spent time under contract with the studio, appearing in a series of films that were moderately successful and thoroughly wholesome in the specific way that Disney films of that era were thoroughly wholesome, which is to say that they operated within a moral universe where problems were solvable and effort was rewarded, and the right person generally ended up in the right place. He had played a young football player and a young adventurer and various other configurations of appealing young American boyhood. He had been, by all accounts, a pleasant and professional presence on set and in the studio, and somewhere in the process of all of that, Walt had seen something, had seen the specific quality that made him reach for a piece of paper and write the name down. You wonder what that quality was. Russell would go on to be known for a certain kind of self-possession, a quality of being entirely comfortable inside his own skin, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable on screen than almost anything else. He had warmth without softness, and confidence without arrogance, and a face that registered complex emotions without appearing to work at it. Whether Walt had identified all of this in a teenager doing bit parts on the Disneyland television program is impossible to know, but Walt had an eye for exactly this kind of thing, had always had it, had spotted talent with a consistency that suggested something more systematic than luck. The note itself is documented in various accounts of Walt's final days, though the precise circumstances of its discovery, whether it was found on the desk after his death, or had been seen while he was still in the hospital, are slightly variable, depending on who is telling the story. What is consistent across accounts is the fact of it. 2 words in Walt Disney's handwriting, the name of a young actor, written sometime in that last week when he was still coming to the studio, still sitting at the desk, still thinking forward, you find yourself returning to the desk. Not literally, of course. You're here, wherever here is for you tonight, in whatever arrangement of pillows and blankets and soft lamplight constitutes your particular version of the end of a day. But in the mind, you keep returning to the desk, to the specific quality of that Tuesday afternoon, to the way a working day looks from the inside when you do not know it is the last one. There is a particular kind of peace in that image, strange as it sounds, not the peace of resolution or completion, because Walt's story did not resolve or complete in any conventional sense. The project's unfinished. The Florida city never built as he imagined it. The future he was so constantly oriented toward arriving without him to witness it. But the peace of a man who was, right up until the end, doing the thing. Still at the desk. Still with the pen. Still making notes about what came next. Most lives do not end with such perfect consistency of character. Most lives end in hospital beds, with the to-do list paused mid-item, the normal activities of a normal person simply interrupted without ceremony. Walt's life ended that way too, of course, in a hospital bed in Burbank, with a California December light presumably coming through windows somewhere nearby. But the last conscious creative act, the last note, the last exercise of the particular muscle that had defined him, happened at the desk, happened in the studio, happened in the place he had built and inhabited and filled with the specific atmosphere of his imagination. You think about what it means to write someone's name, not in the abstract, but in the specific physical act of it, the pen touching the paper, the letters forming in sequence, the slight pressure of a hand that has written thousands of names and thousands of notes and thousands of ideas across decades of creative labor. The name arrives on the paper and is given a kind of permanence it did not have before, lifted out of the air of thought and fixed to a surface. Kurt Russell. 2 words. An instruction to a future self, a reminder to follow up, a note in the ongoing conversation Walt was conducting with the project of what came next. That future self never arrived to read the note. The follow-up never happened. The conversation was interrupted in the way all conversations eventually are. But the name stayed on the paper, and the paper stayed in the world, and Kurt Russell went on to have a career that is now more than 5 decades long, and occasionally, when someone asks him about it, he talks about what it means to carry that particular piece of information. The studio that Walt left behind was a strange and disorienting place in the years immediately following his death. This is not unusual. When the person who is the organizing principle of a creative enterprise is no longer present, the enterprise tends to move through a period of uncertainty that can last years or decades. The people who had worked with Walt had been, in a certain sense, working with a compass rather than a map, following the direction of his instincts and his enthusiasms and his corrections when they drifted off course. Without him there, they had to construct their own maps from memory, which is a different and considerably harder thing. The films made in the decade following his death are often described as lesser work, and some of them are. There is a quality of hesitation in certain films of that period, a wariness about taking risks, a retreat toward the safe and the familiar that is understandable given the circumstances and still a little sad. The studio was missing the specific kind of courage that comes from having someone at the center who is so committed to his vision that the fear of failure is simply insufficient to slow him down. Walt had been spectacularly unafraid of failure in the operational sense, even though it had visited him more than once. He had gone forward anyway, with a confidence that was partly temperament and partly something that looked from the outside very much like faith. What he had faith in is interesting to consider. Not religion exactly, though he had been raised in a church-going household, and the moral architecture of his films reflects certain values that have a clearly religious lineage. Not technology, exactly, though he loved technology and was a genuinely early adopter of every new thing that came along and could talk about the mechanics of whatever the latest innovation was with a specificity that surprised people who expected him to be purely a creative figure. What he had faith in was closer to human longing. He believed, with what appeared to be absolute and unwavering conviction, that people wanted to be moved, that the desire to experience wonder and warmth and the specific emotion of a story going right was not a weakness or a childish thing that adults should grow out of, but a central and legitimate need, as important in its own way as the need for food or shelter or connection. And he spent his life trying to meet that need. That was the project. That was the through line running beneath all the individual projects, the mouse and the dwarfs and the castle and the park and the Florida city and the name on the piece of paper. He was trying, with whatever tools were available to him, to give people the experience of wonder, to remind them that wonder was available, that it did not require a specific age or a specific set of circumstances or any kind of permission. You think about Disneyland in its early years. Walt's original vision for the park was shaped by a specific and personal frustration. He had taken his daughters to amusement parks, the ordinary amusement parks of the 1940s and 1950s, and he had found them dirty and chaotic and slightly shabby, places where the rides were the point and everything surrounding the rides was an afterthought. He had sat on a bench eating peanuts while his daughters rode the carousel, and he had thought, with the particular quality of thought that in his case tended to produce actual things in the actual world, that there had to be a better version of this. A version where the whole environment was intentional, where the experience of being in the space, not just the individual rides or attractions, was the thing, where cleanliness and story and detail and care were woven into every surface and every sound and every smell. He had no experience building parks. He had experience building worlds on film, which is a related but substantially different skill set. The physics are different. The logistics are different. The scale is different in ways that matter enormously. A park cannot be edited after it opens the way a film can be edited before it is released. A park exists in actual space with actual weather and actual crowds and actual maintenance requirements. The problems are different problems. He hired people who knew things he did not know, and he learned from them, and he ignored the parts he disagreed with, and he made decisions that his financial advisors told him were inadvisable, and he pushed the construction timeline until it was a schedule that caused serious people to question his connection to reality. And then he opened the park on July 17th, 1955, with the soft asphalt and the counterfeit tickets and the plumbing failures, and he stood there in the middle of it, and he watched people walk through the gates into the world he had built, and he saw on their faces the specific expression he had been imagining for years. That expression is the real subject of this story, in a way. Not the park, not the films, not the Kurt Russell note, the expression on the faces of people encountering something they did not know they needed until they found it. Walt spent 65 years trying to produce that expression, trying to reliably and repeatedly generate it, trying to understand its chemistry and its conditions so he could replicate it. He was extraordinarily good at it, and he was still trying, still at the desk, still making notes, when his body ran out of time. The name Kurt Russell is, among other things, evidence of that, evidence of a man still in the process, still looking at the world with the specific quality of attention that asks, what can this become? Who can help make it? What is the next thing? He saw a young actor and he thought, there is something there, something worth developing, something worth noting down, so it is not lost in the general flow of everything else that requires attention. And he wrote the name, You Let That Settle. You let it be what it is, which is both ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, the way most true things are. A man at a desk in December, a pen in his hand, a name on a piece of paper, and then the pen down, and the afternoon continuing, and December the 15th arriving with its terrible arithmetic. The particular room at the studio where Walt worked is preserved now in a way that carries its own quiet weight. Not everything in the room is exactly as it was, because nothing is ever exactly as it was, time being the one remodeling project that never stops. But the effort has been made, the care has been applied, the objects have been gathered and arranged as faithfully as the evidence permits. People who work at the studio today pass by it. They know what it is. They know something about what happened there, and what was written there, and what was thought there across decades of creative work. There is something particular about the experience of knowing that a room was the place where a specific person did a specific kind of thinking. The room does not look different than it would if the person had never been there. The walls are walls. The desk is a desk. The windows let in the same California light they have always let in, but knowing changes the experience of seeing, always. Knowing makes the room into a place rather than just a space, makes it hold something. Walt would have found the preservation slightly embarrassing, probably. He was not, by most accounts, a person who was particularly comfortable being the subject of reverence. He deflected it with jokes and with the insistence that the thing, whatever the thing was more important than the person making it. He told the story of Mickey Mouse by saying that the mouse had saved the studio, not that he had saved the studio by creating the mouse, which is a meaningful distinction. He put the characters in front of himself and let them receive the attention while he operated as much as possible from behind the curtain, though of course he was also a masterful self-promoter who understood the value of his own name and image in ways that occasionally contradicted the humility narrative. The television program that brought his name into living rooms across America was called Disneyland, and then Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, and it featured Walt himself as host, walking through sets and sitting at desks and talking to cameras with the warm authority of a man who was entirely comfortable being the face of the thing. He was complicated, the way interesting people usually are, both genuinely modest about certain things and genuinely aware of his own significance in ways that were not remotely modest. You think about Lillian, his wife of 41 years. They had met at the studio in the 1920s when she was an ink and paint artist and he was the young animator trying to hold together a fledgling operation on faith and borrowed money. They had married in 1925, and they had built a life together that ran parallel to the building of everything else, the studio and the characters and the park and the empire. She was, by most accounts, not a particularly public person. She did not seek the spotlight that surrounded her husband, and she did not particularly enjoy the parts of his life that required them to be in it together. She preferred the private versions of things, the dinners at home, the quiet evenings, the ordinary domestic texture of a life lived beside someone, rather than in performance of a life for an audience. She survived him by 31 years. She died in December of 1997, 31 years almost to the month after his death, which is either a coincidence or the kind of thing you notice when you're paying attention to the patterns that lives make. She gave money to build the concert hall in Los Angeles that bears both their names, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, which opened in 2003 and which is one of the most distinctive buildings in the city, its curved metallic surfaces catching and returning the California light in ways that change by the hour. It is a beautiful building. Walt would have been interested in the engineering of it. He was always interested in the engineering. In the years immediately after his death, the question of what Walt would have wanted became something of a governing anxiety for the studio and the people in it. It is a question that is almost impossible to answer honestly, because the person who could answer it is the person who is no longer available, and the imagination of what they would have wanted is inevitably shaped by the desires of the people doing the imagining. Walt would have wanted this. Walt would have hated that. Walt would have approved of this direction. Walt would have been furious about that decision. These conversations happened continuously, and they were useful insofar as they encouraged people to apply a standard of quality and intention that they might otherwise have let slip, and they were problematic insofar as a dead man's imagined preferences became a constraint on the living imagination of the people who survived him. The studio eventually found its way to a second period of creative vitality in the 1980s and 90s, the era that is sometimes called the Disney Renaissance, producing films like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King that recaptured something of the original quality of feeling from the early decades. New people with new ideas working within a structure that Walt's vision had built, extending it into territory that Walt himself had not imagined because the territory did not yet exist. It is, in a way, exactly what he would have wanted, if the question of what he would have wanted can be answered at all. Movement. Evolution. The thing continuing. And Kurt Russell went on to do what he went on to do, which is a career that includes more than 100 films, roles in some of the most significant American movies of the last half-century, a particular reputation for a kind of rugged and self-possessed screen presence that audiences have found reliably appealing across decades. He worked with John Carpenter and with Quentin Tarantino, and with a long list of directors who saw in him exactly the thing that Walt had apparently seen in a teenager on a studio lot in the 1960s. The specific quality, the thing that is hard to name and easy to recognize once you know how to look. He was aware of the note. He spoke about it occasionally, with the kind of reflective gravity that the situation warrants. To be the last word, to have your name be the thing that was written at the end of something. It is not a weight you can put down or a fact you can unknow. It becomes part of the story you tell about yourself, the strange constellation of events that make you who you are and put you where you are and connect you. through the thinnest and most unexpected of threads, to things that were much larger than your individual existence. Walt Disney did not know, when he wrote the name, that it would be the last thing he wrote. This is the fact you keep returning to, because it seems important in a way that resists easy articulation. He was not composing a final message. He was not constructing a legacy statement. He was doing Tuesday. He was doing the work that the Tuesday required, which included thinking about who might be right for what, and writing the name down so it did not get lost. The grandeur arrived later, imposed by circumstance and by time, by the fact of what happened next. In the moment, it was only a note. This is, when you consider it from a certain angle, actually the most comforting version of the story. The idea that a life can be going that fully, that the forward momentum can be so genuine and so unperformed that right up until the body stops being able to cooperate with the mind is still at the desk, still oriented toward what comes next, still making notes about the future. There is no collapse into smallness. There is no narrowing to the point of a single last breath with nothing before it but the awareness of ending. There is the Tuesday, there is the desk, there is the name on the paper, and then December 15th, and then the light going out of that particular window, and then the lot continuing in December sunshine, the buildings he had designed still standing, the characters he had made still moving through the world on screens and in parks and on the merchandise in the stores on Main Street, which was itself a street he had built, a fiction made solid, a memory of something that had never quite existed, translated into pavement and storefronts and the smell of popcorn on a California afternoon. The note itself does not survive in the way that famous documents survive, framed and climate-controlled and behind glass in an institution that has decided it matters enough to protect. It was a working note, a Tuesday note, the kind of thing that accumulates in offices and is cleared away when offices are cleared, which is either a loss or simply the appropriate fate for a piece of paper that was always meant to be temporary. What survives is the account of it, the fact of it, the reporting by people who saw it and remembered it, and eventually told the story to journalists and biographers who wrote it down in books, where it has now lived for decades. You think about all the things that survive and all the things that don't. The films survive, the park survives, the ideas survive, transformed and transmuted and extended into forms that Walt did not anticipate and might or might not have recognized. His voice survives on recordings, doing the voice of Mickey Mouse and narrating promotional films and speaking at press conferences and television appearances. The actual physical sound of him preserved in the way sounds can now be preserved indefinitely against entropy. The name on the paper survives as a story, which may be the most durable kind of survival available to any particular detail. Stories change as they travel, picking up interpretations and losing others, but the core of them, the thing that gives them their staying power, tends to be something that connects to something true about the human experience. The thing that connects here is the idea of being found, of someone looking at you and seeing something and being moved to write it down, of your name becoming the last word in someone else's story, without either of you having arranged for it to happen that way. Kurt Russell was found by many people in the course of his career, and he found himself in the particular way that actors and artists find themselves through the work they do. But the first finding, or one of the first findings, happened on a lot in Burbank, when a 65-year-old man with a cigarette and a vision and a fatal diagnosis and 40 years of impossible achievement behind him looked at a teenager and thought, yes, that one, and reached for the paper and picked up the pen. You are getting sleepy now. You have been getting sleepy for a while, and this is as it should be, because the story has done what stories do when they are working. It has given your mind something to move through gently, something with enough texture to follow, and not so much urgency that it keeps you awake. You are somewhere in the vicinity of the Burbank studio in December, in the warm amber light of a Tuesday afternoon, and the desk is there, and the papers are there, and somewhere in the stack of notes and memos and sketches and blueprints is a small piece of paper with 2 words on it. The lot is quiet now, in the way that lots are quiet at the end of the working day. People have gone home. The buildings settle into the evening with the particular quality of silence that buildings have when they are empty of the people who give them their purpose. The offices go dark one by one. The parking lot empties. The California night arrives with its gentleness, its mild December air, its stars that are harder to see now than they were in 1966, because the light of the city has grown and multiplied and pushed them back. But they are still there. The stars are still there. The ones you cannot see and the ones you can. And somewhere in the distance, there's the hum of a city that keeps going, regardless of what any individual day has contained. And there is a note on a desk in a building that has since been used for 1,000 other purposes. And there are 2 words in handwriting that will not be written again. And the future that was being pointed toward keeps arriving and arriving and arriving, changed from what anyone imagined, but still arriving. You let your breathing slow. You let the story settle around you the way stories settle when you're no longer quite alert enough to examine them, and they simply become atmosphere, the way music becomes atmosphere. You stop listening to it and start being inside it instead. Walt at the desk, the pen, the name, the Tuesday, the December light, the note that was not meant to be a last note, but became one, the young actor who did not know he had been written down, the brother who would not retire, the park that kept being built, the city that was never quite built, the films that survived, the voice on the recordings, the desk in the room in the building on the lot under the California sky. You are almost there. You're almost in the place where the story lets go and sleep takes over, the place where one kind of imagining gives way to another kind, the involuntary kind, the kind where your mind makes things without being asked and without knowing quite what it is making or why. It is a good place. It is the place you were moving toward when you closed your eyes and let the words in. The name on the paper glows faintly in the dark. Not literally, metaphorically, in the way that certain small things glow in the memory, because they have been held up to the light of enough attention for long enough that they have absorbed some of it and give it back in the dark. 2 words, a Tuesday in December. A man at the end of his life who did not know it was the end, doing the thing he had always done, which was to look forward, to write down what he saw, to trust that someone would eventually read it. Someone did. You did tonight, here in the quiet, in the dark, in the place between waking and whatever comes after waking. You read the name, you held it for a while, and now you can let it go, let it drift back into the December afternoon where it belongs, into the amber light and the papers on the desk, and the working day that was also, without announcing itself, the last day, into the ordinary, extraordinary Tuesday of a life that was always, in every note and every sketch and every park and every film and every name written down and every future pointed toward, a life of extraordinary, ordinary Tuesdays. Sleep now. The story is done. The desk is quiet. The light is out. And somewhere in the California dark, the stars are still there, doing what stars do, which is to shine without any particular concern for whether anyone below them is awake or asleep or in between. Shining because that is what they do, have done, will do, forward and forward into the future that keeps arriving without anyone to plan it, arriving anyway, as it always has.